G'day! Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is Dr. Aaron Pegram from the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, and he's joined us today to talk about the AIF in 1917 on the Western Front and the costly battles that occurred in 1917. Hi Aaron, thanks for joining us on the show.
And Adam, thank you very much for having me on your show in one of your first episodes. It's quite an honour to be here with you, talking history.
No, thanks, mate. I really, as I said, I really do appreciate it. So, Aaron, can you just give us a brief background for our listeners, because it's a new show? Can you just tell us what you actually do at the War Memorial?
Sure thing. My name is Aaron Pegram, and as you said, I work as a senior historian at the Australian War Memorial. I've been at the memorial for 13 years, and most of that time I've worked in the military history section, which is the small enclave of historians that the memorial has. What the role of the historians at the Australian War Memorial is very different to those of historians who work in universities, for example. We are what we refer to as public historians. Our audience isn't an academic audience. Ours is the Australian public, or the public who come to the organisation and to learn something about Australia's military history. And so memorial historians do a whole host of things, all aimed at disseminating Australian military history to a wide and general audience. They come on shows, on podcasts, and talk about military history. They lead battlefield tours overseas, and that's one thing I was doing during the First World War centenary was leading battlefield tours to the Western Front. We work on exhibitions. I had the good fortune of working on Memorial's expanded First World War gallery in the lead up to the First World War centenary. We publish books. I've written 4 books on the Australian prisoner of war experience. One book on Australian Victoria Crosses for Valour, Australians awarded the Victoria Cross. My latest book, Surviving the Great War, Australian Prisoners of War on the Western Front from 1916 to 1918, just come out with Cambridge University Press. We also write articles for the War Memorials magazine, Wartime. I just had an article published on Operation Millennium, which is the RAF's 1,000-bomber raid on the German city of Cologne in May 1942. We do a whole host of things. We consult to government, from writing briefs from Governor Generals, Prime Ministers, Members of Parliament, to making sure they're not making any historical gaffes. And then when we're not doing all of that, we're working on our own projects. At the moment, I'm currently assigned to the Memorial's Gallery Development Project, where I'm working on the Memorial's expanded and redeveloped galleries, looking at Australia and the Middle East conflicts from the Gulf War in 1990-91 all the way through to Afghanistan, Iraq, and current ADF operations in Iraq and Syria. So quite a different gear change from the First World War, which has been my bread and butter for most of those 13 years, and to getting into some recent conflicts. And also in that space, I've had the good fortune of actually deploying to the Middle East with the Australian Defence Force. These are collecting missions to collect objects, record interviews, take photographs for future displays at the Australian War Memorial, because it's better to actually be collecting those objects and recording those stories in the now, whilst those operations are still ongoing, rather than doing it 60, 70 years down the track. So last year I went off to the Middle East, where I visited two missions that Australians are currently deployed. Operation Paladin, which is a UN mission involving about 11 Australians. They're based in Israel, and as UN observers, they're observing a ceasefire agreement between the Israelis and the Syrians and in South Lebanon. And then also I travelled over to the Sinai Desert, where there's about 30 Australians who are contributing as part of the mentoring multinational force and observers group, and they're monitoring a ceasefire between the Egyptians and the Israelis. 2 very little-known peacekeeping efforts, and certainly our mission there was to collect objects, record their experiences, and bring them back home so that we can tell their stories in the Australian War Memorial. So hopefully that gives you some idea as to what I do. No 2 days are ever the same. I guarantee you that I always look forward to turning up to work on a Monday and not necessarily knowing what's going to greet me. I get a lot of people writing in, emailing me, asking about their family experiences during the First World War, and certainly over the last 10 years or so, I've taken a lot of people over to the Western Front battlefields. So I'm actually researching and telling the story of individuals who fought and died over 100 years ago, and relating them to their family members is certainly a great honour and privilege that I really enjoy.
Mate, it sounds like fascinating work, and I'm jealous, mate, of the work you do at Memorial. It's fantastic. As you said, it's great work to keep up and do now instead of 70 years down the track. As I've often said, if you love what you do, it's never a job.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, it has its moments. Let's like as all jobs do. But I mean, those are challenges that make it all the more rewarding. And certainly, when I finished my university studies, I knew I wanted to get a job at the War Memorial, and so I studied a Bachelor of Arts with honours in history at Charles Sturt University in Wagga. And I knew that if I wanted to pursue a career in history, I actually would have had to move to Canberra. So everything I did was a step in the direction to get a job at the Memorial. So I began working at Old Parliament House, where I sort of got my first exhibition experience in redeveloping the Parliamentary Press Gallery there. I worked at the National Museum as a curator or an assistant curator for 2 years. That gave me a good understanding of the process of museum work. And then finally, after about 3.5 years, I finally got the foot in the door in the War Memorial, and I haven't looked back since.
A lot of people say that the work you guys do at the Memorial is very special, and you can be very proud of what you've achieved, and especially in the centenary years gone by from the First World War. It's something that I think you guys did very well, and definitely you engaged with you brought so many people into history who may not have been in it before, and it's a credit to you guys, and the Memorial did a great job, and I take my hat off to you, mate. You did a fantastic job, so well done.
Oh, fantastic. Well, if someone comes away from the Memorial having viewed our galleries or attended a last post ceremony and wanted to go away and read something more about military history, whether it be researching their family's own wartime experiences or picking up a book and reading about Australian military history, then as far as I'm concerned, that's mission success. As I said, our job is to disseminate Australian military history and make it accessible to our visitors.
Oh, absolutely, and I think it's a job you do very well. So it leads me into today's topic, mate. And can you tell the listeners 1917? So we had obviously we had the Somme come to an end in November, and in 1916. How did 1917 start for the AIF?
Sure thing. Well, just a bit of a recap. The Australians had arrived on the Western Front after fighting on Gallipoli, and effectively the AIF doubling in size in late 1915 and early 1916. The first Australian units had arrived on the Western Front to fight in the main theatre of war against the main antagonist of the war, the Imperial German Army, in April 1916. They spent some time around outside Armentières, the township of Armentières, which was sort of a relatively quiet area because of the area's low-lying terrain and high water table. It was terrain that was quite unsuited for any major offensive action. So the British used that area as a place to kind of rest its veteran formation, to train its very new units, such as the new Kitchener Army formations, and also to the AIF, who just arrived on the Western Front, and blood them in routine patrols, trench raids. Also, the Germans, the more veteran German units in the area, used it to rest their formations. The Australians had fought their first major action of the war nearby at a place called Fromelles on the night of 20th July 1916. It was the Australian 5th Division. It was the newest of the 5 Australian infantry divisions. It was equally the most inexperienced, and within one night of fighting, they suffered over 5,000 casualties, which included about 1,800 dead. And that was the first Now, that was Australia's main introduction to the fighting on the Western Front, this extremely costly and unsuccessful action, which kind of sets the tone for some of the bitter fighting that the Australians subsequently take part in. Not long afterwards, they get engaged in the fighting on the Somme, the first main British offensive on the Western Front, much further south. The Australians aren't committed to the fighting on the 1st of July, which kind of arrests British public imagination, but they are drawn into the fighting around the town of Pozières. Initially, the capture of Pozières is an absolute success, but successive rotations of the Australian divisions in and out of the line around Pozières and Mouquet Farm is extremely costly, mainly because the Germans hold a high ground around the village, that the gains that the Australians had made had pushed a significant bulge into German lines, which the guns, the heavy artillery of an entire German army corps then focus on the town of Pozières. And that results in over 26,000 Australian casualties, battle casualties, in less than 6 weeks. In keeping in mind that 8 months on Gallipoli had cost the Australians within the region of 26,000 casualties in 8 months of fighting. Well, the Australians had just lost that in 8 weeks in Fromelles and the Somme combined. So needless to say, when the Australians come out of the line after the Somme in September 1916, they're very much worse for wear. The Australian Imperial Force is an all-volunteer army, meaning there's no conscription in Australia, that all the soldiers in Australian khaki have signed on the dotted line as volunteers for the duration of the war. And the reality is, units aren't spending much time on the Western Front before they're extremely decimated in these extremely violent industrial scale actions. Battalions that are usually at around 1,000 rifles at full strength are being rapidly reduced to about 600 within just one or two major attacks, or even just one or two sort of periods in the line, in the frontline positions. So by 1917, the Australians are still recovering from its significant losses from 1916. We have to say, and we're going to get a little bit into this later on, but the fighting on the Western Front is not all sort of carnage, 7 days a week, 24/7. It's in fact, it's quite seasonal. Most of the major offensives, either British or German or French, of course, are dependent on the weather and also the seasons. So no commander in their right mind would launch a major offensive in the autumn or winter months. The fighting is usually done around the summer and the spring, when the ground is hard, it's ideal conditions, and then also too in areas where the terrain is quite suitable to the attacking formation. So what happens when the Australians are pulled out of the line after their stint on the Somme? It's nearing the end of autumn and winter is approaching. Fortunately, they spent a little bit of time in late September, early October, up into their first rotation up into the Ypres sector in Belgium, in around a little place called Saint-Éloi, which is just south of Ypres. And there the Australians sort of undergo, 1st and 2nd Anzac Corps engage in routine patrolling, some trench raids. And this is kind of a period of rest for them. Despite the fact that they're resting in a sort of relatively quiet area, they're still going out on patrols at night, they're still conducting trench raids on the German positions, they're still taking casualties from artillery and from gas. So even during quiet periods of on the Western Front, it's still quite kinetic. So when winter comes, the fighting is relatively stagnant. The Australians returned back down to the Somme in late 1916, around November, and where the line had sort of moved beyond Pozières up to the villages of around Flers and Goudecourt. And this is after the first main sort of action involving British tanks, the first use of tanks in modern warfare that had only just taken place several weeks before, but they occupy that sector that's being captured from the Germans. And there the Australians spend the coldest and bitterest winter that's ascended upon Europe in 40 years. If you can imagine an area that had been raked by British and German artillery fire for months, and then suddenly the autumn rains had come early, and the whole area had been turned into quite a literal quagmire. The Germans, because they've sighted their positions on ground of their own choosing, they occupy the high ground. And so they have direct line of sight onto the British positions that the British have just captured. And so the Australians occupy this position alongside the New Zealanders and the British in this horrible extreme terrain where ultimately there are a few attacks, but owing to the inclement weather and the ultimate coming of winter, it's down to a standstill. And so they, in the end, it's ultimately the snow, the rain, the frostbite, disease, and these become far greater enemies than the Imperial German army during this period. Sickness is an all-time high. Morale within the AIF is at an all-time low. In fact, it's at its lowest period of the war. Units have been completely decimated from the Somme fighting, although they are taking fresh reinforcements in preparation for the fighting in 1917. And there's this uncertainty that the war is going to continue. And all that changes at the end of winter. The Australian units rotate in and out, the divisions rotate in and out of that sector throughout the rest of that winter. And then in mid-February 1917, things suddenly change. And what appears to be an ordinary routine day along the Western Front, Australian patrols go out to find that the Germans who had previously been there in the days before suddenly weren't. And that then begins the Australia's long and bitter campaign in the fighting of 1917.
It's hard to believe that the elements was their biggest enemy and not the German army.
Well, during that period in the winter of 1916, 1917, that was certainly the case. But they had gone through the ordeal of the fighting on the Somme, and particularly at Pozières, where the bombardment was so concentrated it equaled anything that was the most concentrated on the Western Front through the duration of the war. So men who survived that then had to endure this grisly winter. So, I mean, there are cases of Australians shooting themselves in the foot, in the arms, taking their own lives, anything for a reprieve from the frontline duties of an infantryman. And it's not just the infantry who suffer as well. I mean, there's the artillery have all, their gun positions are set up in mud holes not too far away from the frontline positions to provide necessary fire support for the guys in the forward areas and to suppress the German positions as well. I mean, they're doing it tough. Ration parties that make their way up the line, engineering units, they've got it takes them literally hours, anywhere up to 6 hours to make their way up through these mud congested trenches up to the forward positions. Sometimes ration parties get so completely hopelessly lost it takes them days to bring the rations up to the forward area, all the while being shot at by the Germans, gassed, bombarded. I think field ambulance units, I mean, they're all, this becomes an endemic problem. Casualties are occurring in the frontline positions, but then if it's ultimately going to be taking hours, sometimes more than a day, to extricate your wounded from the forward area, their chances of survival are significantly lowered. So, I mean, all this plays a significant role during that period. But the irony is, you go to that area today, around Fleurs and Gueudecourt, it's very picturesque farmland. Tall grass, poppies, French farmers are tilling the fields with their tractors. You still see evidence of the fighting through the iron harvest, through unexploded ordnance, which routinely comes to the surface. But always, as long as you're looking towards the east, which is ultimately where the Germans are, you notice the Germans always have the high ground. You realise that when you have a look at that terrain today, you're always looking uphill towards the Germans, where the Germans ultimately weren't.
Obviously, as you say, Aaron, the Germans had the high ground, so they had their strategic position of being, and like you said, the Germans were suffering the same as the British and the Australians as well in the trenches in 16-17 as well with the winter.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But also too, the Germans had taken a lot of casualties, not just on the Somme, but also at Verdun against the French. Much further south. In fact, the whole reason the Somme campaign exists is to so that the British could get into a major offensive spat with the Germans on the Western Front, but then also secondly, to relieve the pressure that was then being pinned against the French much further south. The Germans had suffered enormous amounts of casualties, and the fighting on the Somme had pushed a significant bulge into the German territory. So what the Germans had done throughout that winter was construct a new and more formidable series of defences. known in German as die Siegfriedstellung, or to the British as the Hindenburg Line, which was several dozen kilometres further away to the rear. And this was not just a series of one or two series of trenches. This was a thick belt of German fortifications that consisted of thick belts of barbed wire, an intricate trench system, mutually supportive machine gun positions, artillery that was all pre-registered, that was erected in a zone of anywhere up to 40 kilometres. So if you can imagine an attacking force trying to break into this this fortification system, say they overran the first series of trenches, there was probably about 6 or 7 trench systems behind that. And this was the brick wall that the Germans had constructed to impede what was expected to be another British assault during 1917. So as far as the Germans were concerned, this was the German Empire's new western border. They weren't moving, but they were expecting another British assault. What the construction of the Hindenburg Line ultimately did was it also nipped off that salient in the Somme area, which meant there was less German troops required to man that position. So the Germans fell back by about 40 kilometres to their new and more formidable Hindenburg Line system, and that's where they bugged out to in February 1917. And certainly, if anybody has recently watched the film 1917, which is a spectacular piece of cinema, that's set during this period where the British Army, which also includes the Australians, are suddenly faced with the realisation that, hey, the Germans are no longer here on the Somme, and they're following up in the advance of the withdrawing Germans. The Germans have rear guards stationed in some of the villages which have been left behind. The Germans have implemented a sort of scorched earth policy. They've cut down trees along a lot of the Roman roads to impede motor transport, poisoned wells. They've destroyed and ransacked villages, left delayed mines with delayed charges in many of the major towns within the area. And this is all to delay a rapid British advance to ultimately what will be a showdown along the Hindenburg Line.
It's a great topic that you touch on, Aaron, with the 1917 film. So can you go into a little bit more detail of what both Anzac Corps were doing and what their tactics were, and were they doing peaceful penetration, or what was the tactics that were being used in 1917 that weren't being used in 1916?
Sure thing. Well, when the AIF arrives in France, it forms part of a much broader British Army. There is all these national distinctions within the British Army itself, which also includes all the Empire troops, no less than including the Australians, New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Newfoundlanders, because the Newfoundland is not yet part of Canada, the Indians, of course. And I mean, they're all considered British troops, and as such, their uniforms are all khaki and woolen khaki. They all kind of look the same. They're all equipped with Lee Enfield rifles, Vickers guns, Lewis guns. There is now at brigade assets. They have trench mortars. They have machine gun detachments. I mean, these are assets. These new formations, such as those brigade assets, are new to the British Army's arsenal, mainly through the experience of fighting on the Western Front throughout 1914 and 1915. So when the Australians arrive on the Western Front, they actually have new kit and equipment that they didn't necessarily have on Gallipoli. So they've got Mills bombs, they've got Lewis guns, they've got steel helmets, and this is all preparing them for the combat on the Western Front. The historian Gary Sheffield, for example, in the 1990s developed this concept of the learning curve, that the British Army as a whole had to learn lessons of 1916 in order to implement the successes that it ultimately had during 1917 and 1918. That didn't necessarily mean that there was less casualties, but certainly the tactics that were implemented by the British Expeditionary Force, which included the Australians, was developing and changing on a constant rate. So by 1917, the Australians had just really started to get to grips with the main sort of main tactical concepts, the new tactical concepts. But of course, the fighting on the Somme had generated a whole new set of lessons learned. So on the Somme, we saw the first creeping barrages. The first Australians, the first time the Australians experienced that was the assault on the Ogier lines just east of Pozières village in July 1916. But of course, up until then, one of the main tactics was for the artillery to shell a position under a hurricane bombardment. There would be a short pause before the infantry assault. But what that ultimately did was it warned the Germans an attack was coming. The enemy survivors could then race to their guns and then meet an expected British attack with inflicting a great toll with their belt-fed water-cooled machine guns. By 1917, things were a bit different. But that sort of really didn't come into being during this initial phase, because the British were expecting the Germans to still be there once that grisly cold winter had ended. The Germans had bugged out, and then for your poor frontline infantrymen, suddenly the Germans aren't there, and then there's this rapid advance that takes place. They're advancing over terrain that had not been raked by shell fire, these green fields, fertile farmland that had not been destroyed by months of artillery bombardment. It looked like the Germans were on the back foot. There were still some skirmishes, as I referred to, engagements with German rearguards in those villages. There's the Australians captured the town of Bapaume, and then there's also some nasty little fights around those villages on the other side of Bapaume, such as Douanier, Hermes, Lagnacourt, for example. But the Australians ultimately are able to take them. So this is kind of fighting over open mobile territory. In fact, there's a light horse detachment on the Western Front, and they're screening the Allied advance. They're actually being used in a reconnaissance role on the Western Front. I mean, when we think of the light horse, we inevitably think of Beersheba, but their main role was reconnaissance and scouting, and that's what they were doing during this early period of the war. Where things really start to get a bit different is when the British gain contact with this formidable German Hindenburg Line system. And for the Australians, they encounter it after they capture the town of Norroy in April 1917. And they're, alongside the British, they're facing off a re-entrant. So they're looking into a basin of a German position, and they're expecting to assault it. In early April, the Canadians had pulled off a very stunning victory at Vimy Ridge. There had been further successes by the French much further south around the Canal du Nord, and it looked as if though when the British did was able to prepare itself for a main assault on the Hindenburg Line, all things indicated to the fact that this would be a relative pushover. By that stage, the British began implementing the use of tanks once again. I mentioned that the first use of tanks had been at Flers in September 1916. There was some hope that perhaps tanks could be integrated into an infantry assault, and these would hopefully advance ahead of the infantry without the need for an artillery bombardment to suppress the German positions or indeed alert the Germans an attack was coming. That they would be sufficient enough to crawl ahead, crush these thick belts of barbed wire, allowing the infantry to spill through and capture these German positions. But sorry to say that it inevitably didn't turn out that way. The first main sort of test, I guess, of this theory was the Australians had the great misfortune of being under the command of the British General Sir Hubert Gough, who was the commander of 5th or Reserve Army that carried out this assault into a re-entrant, which means that they were assaulting into an area where they were being fired on. They would have been fired on from 3 separate sides, from the front and then from the 2 flanks. Gough had rested his entire success of the operation with these tanks, which were Mark IIs and Mark IIIs, had the speed of approximately around 15 kilometres an hour. They were essentially training tanks. They were poorly armed and armoured, and they were extremely mechanically unreliable. So this particular assault is set to take place on the 10th of April 1917 in the British 62nd Division, which is was attacking the Hindenburg Line positions to the left of the Australians near Bullecourt itself. Ultimately, what happens is the tanks that are ultimately supposed to go ahead of the infantry don't meet their rendezvous on time. They get lost, they suffer mechanical problems, they get ditched. Ultimately, they're not where they're supposed to be just before 0 hour, before this attack begins. And ultimately, the attack is called off. And as much as we like to bash the Pongs and blame them for most of the misgivings and misfortunes that occurred on the Western Front involving the Australians, unfortunately, the Australians didn't pass on, communicate the news that the attack had been postponed to the neighbouring British division. And so the poor British then go in completely unsupported, without tanks, without the Australians on their flank, and those initial patrols that go out to screen their advance incurs as around 300 casualties in something that could have been prevented just by simple communicating between the two divisions. So what ultimately happens is that there's a repeat performance the day after. The whole premise of using these tanks against the Hindenburg Line at Bullecourt is to move away from an artillery bombardment to suppress the Germans, destroy their belts of barbed wire in their defensive positions, and ultimately tip them off an attack was coming. The Germans now know that there is an attack coming because they're owing to this failed British attack the day previously. So the 11th of April 1917, the Australian infantry, along with the British, they all stand out onto their jump-off positions as they were expected the previous day. 0 hour is approaching, and yet again the tanks are nowhere to be seen. They make a delayed start once the 0 hour is approaching. These attacks are all occurring in the early hours of the morning before sunrise, so that the infantry aren't a sitting ducks, essentially. They're not a clear target for German machine gun positions. What's unique about the Bullecourt battlefield is the Germans have forced the attacking force to cross over a kilometre of open ground before getting into the German positions. Sunrise is rapidly approaching. There's about 3 or 4 tanks that are used to assist the Australian 4th Division, who carry out this particular assault towards the nearby village of Riancourt. Ultimately what takes place is the Germans are expecting them. German machine guns and artillery fire then open up on the Australians as they're crossing no man's land. Some of the British tanks are ultimately put out of action by artillery fire, but one succeeds in making its way to the German wire. Two make their way to the German wire, where the Australians are then able to spill into the German positions. Despite all these misgivings, the Australian 4th Brigade, in particular, 4th and 12th Brigades, still succeed in crossing that kilometre of open ground under withering, enfilading machine gun fire and artillery fire, and succeed in getting into the German trenches, where the Germans who are occupying that positions quickly bug out. So they think that they've done a really good job. They've captured this position, this formidable position. They've got a toehold into the Hindenburg Line. But ultimately, what happens is they've basically fallen into the ploy of the Germans. They have the Württemberg 27th Division as this crack formation that are used to demonstrate the new German infantry methods, and that is to lure an attacking force into their positions before hitting them with a series of counterattacks. And that's precisely what happens to the Australians at Bullecourt. The Germans then wait for the Australians to expend their ammunition, defending their modest gains. The sun is up, which means that casualties cannot be evacuated across that 1 kilometre of open ground. Ammunition cannot be brought up. Artillery is still not firing on the German positions because there's still some uncertainty as to what's happening with the Australian troops in the forward area. And ultimately, the Germans exploit this. They hit the Australians with a series of counterattacks, probing their flanks, encircling them, and rolling up the beleaguered Australians with rifles and grenades. There's about 3,000 Australian casualties incurred in that first fight at Bullecourt on the 11th of April 1917, and 1,170 of them had the misfortune of being taken prisoner in what is the largest loss of Australians as prisoners of war in a single engagement during the First World War.
Wow, can you just repeat that POW again, Aaron? I'm astounded. I didn't know it was that many.
Yeah, so of the 3,000 Australian battle casualties that are incurred during the fighting at First Bullock Corps on the 11th of April 1917, that's killed, missing, wounded, 1,170 members of the Australian 4th Division are taken prisoner in one hit. Now, that's something that's not replicated until the fall of Singapore during the Second World War in February 1942. So I was similarly stunned when I came across that statistic. In my own study, and so that initiated. I was quite keen on working out what happened to those guys who were captured, and so as I mentioned previously, my book "Surviving the Great War: Australian Prisoners of War on the Western Front" ultimately tells the story of what happened to those men who fell into the hands of the Germans on that day.
Mate, that's a significant loss to the ARF, absolutely, and we must tell the listeners too, Aaron, that first battle was fought in snow, wasn't it? Like the conditions at Bullecourt were horrendous, weren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, it was spring was quite late in coming, and so normally in France, in around early April, you wouldn't expect snow. But on the 11th of April 1917, there certainly was snow on the ground. When the 4th Brigade laid out on their jumping off tapes before their main assault, waiting for 0 hour, these infantrymen are shivering in a snow-covered battlefield, which of course plays into the German hands, because once the attack gets underway, it's almost sunrise, but then the Germans are popping off illumination flares, and so you have these assaulting waves of infantry that are perfectly marked up against a snow-covered battlefield. Not just that, but you have German machine gun positions that are firing an enfilade along the side at clear targets, at perfectly illuminated, clearly discernible targets that are assaulting right across in front of them.
I read somewhere, Aaron, and correct me if I'm wrong, that future studies of the Battle of Bullecourt have been that it's how not to run a battle, how the battle shouldn't have gone ahead because the ground is so flat and so open. I read it somewhere. Can you correct me if I'm wrong with that, or?
Yeah, look, I've never come across an account of the fighting of Bullecourt, or any historian in his or her right mind who says that Bullecourt was a strategic success. Yes, the attacking force, the Australians and the British succeeded in taking the front line of German trenches. Their objective was to pass through the first, second, and ultimately capture the third line of German positions before another advance would ultimately be made. But even though the fighting for Bullecourt continued throughout May, those initial objectives set for the first day were not met. You're right. I think Bullecourt is a great example of how not to run a battle. However, attacking into a re-entrant without artillery fire and resting the laurels of the entire attack within these 12 untested, untried, particularly unreliable tanks was not exactly a great idea, and the blame for that rests firmly with Goff. But to his credit, dare I say it, he was trying to think of a better solution. He was certainly trying to think outside the box. And that's certainly what happens in the battles of 1918, when innovation and adaptation certainly comes to the fore and plays a significant tactical success. Certainly if some of those battles had had similar results as Bullecourt, we'd probably be decrying those and blaming the British for them. We really must be thinking in terms of, yes, mistakes cost lives, and not just one or two lives. They cost literally thousands of lives, and they ruin the reputation of not just your junior ranks and officers, but your most senior commanders who have the necessary skills and experience to think through these tactical problems to achieve strategic and achieve operational and strategic success. But that doesn't happen until 1918. And the real sort of reason behind that is the technology. We don't necessarily see that coming to the fore until 1918, when there's a concerted coordination between infantry, artillery, air assets, and infantry, artillery, aircraft, it's all there, and that's the recipe for success. And tanks, of course.
Yeah.
So, if anything, First Bullet Corps is the kind of it leaves a sour taste in the mouths of Australians, particularly when there's anything relating to the tanks. There's a certain reluctance for the Australians to be involved in any other tank operations. But certainly tanks and the way in which they're employed in subsequent operations on the Western Front certainly result in major stunning successes that do involve the Australians. So, like I said, we get back to this whole concept of the learning curve or the learning process. I mean, these are mistakes that the British Army and the Australians included learn. They learn from this. These lessons aren't being made in vain, although they are paid in the price of Australians in khaki.
Absolutely. It's a painful lesson, but it's a lesson that had to be learned. Unfortunately, with the sacrifice of men, that's just how war is. Unfortunately, it's the gruesome of what war is. It's no matter what war it is, sacrifice has to be made.
I mean, the British Army had not fought a war like this before. The First World War presented a whole new set of challenges presenting itself to the British, the French, even the Germans. This was all new, different kettle of fish. They had to develop new ways to overcome the challenges of particular problems that were only specific to the fighting on the Western Front. And I think one of the great tragedies about Bullet Corps is the fact that despite the complete failure of that first attack, there's ultimately a second Battle of Bullet Corps, which takes place in May 1917, and it takes place as a grinding battle that goes on for 2 weeks. It doesn't end for 2 weeks. That first battle had involved troops of the Australian 4th Australian Division. The second battle, that 2-week fight, involved elements of the 1st, the 2nd and the 5th Australian Divisions. And by the time that the Australians are able to break into Bullet Corps Village and towards Riancourt Village, at the cost of a combined total of 10,000 casualties,
wow.
The whole operation is called off, and then the British finally get the green light to go ahead with their main major offensive effort, which is always in Belgium, and therein begins the Battle of Messines and the concerted effort to break out of the Ypres salient. So after all that bloodshed, over 10,000 Australian casualties, Bullet Corps and those operations down in the south are no longer deemed worthy or necessary.
Those are astounding figures, and you just shake your head and just like that figure of 10,000 men just casualties or killed. So it in a way, Aaron, you could say that the AIF was a weakening force in 1917.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you would say that the AIF was a weakening force in 1916 after the Battle of the Somme. As I mentioned, the AIF is a completely all-volunteer army. It relies on men to stick up their hand and say, yeah, I'm going to go to enlist and do it, sign on the dotted line for the duration of the war and then some. And what happens is throughout the course of the war, there's a massive amount of enthusiasm in 1914 and 1915, less so towards the end of 1915. By 1916, they refer to reinforcements as the fair dinkum because these guys are under no illusion of what the war is going to involve, because they could see the casualty lists being printed in the Australian newspapers at the time. There is this dwindling force of volunteers, these dribble of reinforcements coming from Australia, and those reinforcement quotas are never at full strength, which ultimately means that as the Australian Imperial Force goes into all these major actions and suffers massive amounts of casualties, they're not necessarily being brought back up to strength. So a battalion that would normally be about 1,000 men is doing well if it's at probably around 700, 800 men. And that gets progressively worse as the longer the war continues, because by 1918, during the most successful advances the British participate in, which of course the Australia Corps participates in, there's actually some battalions that are down to 200 men.
Wow.
And certainly there's such a crisis that some battalions ultimately disband. There's two efforts to try and introduce conscription in Australia. So the forced mandatory requirement of men to enlist to serve in the Australian Imperial Force. The first is they're both referendums that are introduced by Billy Hughes's Labor government. The first in October 1916. This is a subject that pulls the Australian public apart along sectarian, along social lines, along class lines. It is probably one of the most vociferous campaigns and debates within Australian history. It is very narrowly rejected by the Australian people. There's almost just as many people say reject the notion of conscription as there are people who support it. It's not to say that a vote against conscription was an anti-war vote. Everybody agreed that it was unanimous that Australia should still be participating in the war. It was ultimately down to whether or not soldiers or young men should be sent off to the war on their own volition. There was the second conscription plebiscite, which occurs in December 1917 after the Third Battle of Ypres, after massive amounts of fighting and heavy losses incurred by the Australians, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about. And that too is narrowly rejected. And so conscription is a done deal for Australia. Australia remains an all-volunteer force for the duration of the war. I think South Africa and India are other members of the British Dominions that don't introduce conscription. But certainly Australia's not alone, but certainly there's very few countries left in the world who are participating in the Great War who remain without conscription. So to answer your question, yes, the AIF is certainly a dwindling resource the longer the war continues and the longer they're actually being pitched into these actions in an effort to try and break through the German positions.
Like all the years that we were fighting on the Western Front, Aaron, is 1917 our bloodiest and our most costliest year on the Western Front?
It most certainly is. So the Australian Imperial Force, it suffers over 180,000 battle casualties throughout the fighting of 1916, 1917 and 1918. Those battle casualties are men killed, wounded, died of wounds, in the midst of combat. And of course, the total all casualties, which includes gassings, which includes illnesses, it's roughly around the figure of 400,000. But throughout the fighting of 1917, the Australians lose nearly 90,000 battle casualties in just 1917 alone. Wow. I mean, as bad as Bullecourt ultimately was, it wasn't our most significant losses. That ultimately came during the Third Battle of Ypres. In October 1917, the Australian Imperial Force lost 6,000 dead in 1 month.
Wow,
I mean,
1 month.
That's a staggering number. During the Third Battle of Ypres, in 8 weeks of fighting, the Australians lose 38,000 casualties. In just 8 weeks of fighting, of which 6,000 are killed.
Wow. Wow. Mate, I'm just sitting here, just those numbers, like, I don't even know 6,000 people, and just to have them of our small Australian population just gone forever, and it just astounds me that, you know, that was just a normal thing on the Western Front. Like, it was just an ordinary thing that happened. Like, I'm just sitting here, I'm astounded by those numbers. They are just astounding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the death of one Australian soldier has a family back home, and it's not just, you know, a mum and dad or a wife. I mean, he has an extensive family, and that grief and mourning that goes on for years, decades. I mean, in many cases, these men were listed as missing, and it was only many years later or many months later they were officially confirmed as having died because they just simply didn't turn up. They weren't in any German prisoner of war camps, they weren't in any field hospitals, they simply went into action and completely disappeared, and the presumption is that they had died. So if you can imagine being distant back home in Australia, you know, when your loved one is fighting a war on the other side of the world, and then suddenly all communication stops, and then you get a very impersonal message from the Defence Department saying that your loved one was listed as missing and there's no further details. I mean, you can imagine how heartbreaking that could be. The anxiety of not knowing whether they were alive or dead. I mean, that is a conflict, an internal conflict unto its own self there. And I think when we study the First World War, I mean, the focus is always on the combat operations of the Australian Imperial Force, and we tend to think less of the impact of the war at home on the Australians who had to keep the country running, keep family homes running, and in the midst of this great period of turmoil. And they're the sort of the realities that they had to live with and bear, not just during the war years, but in some cases for many decades afterwards.
Absolutely, mate. And it's actually the reason that I actually got into military history was I actually lost 4 family members I had 10 serve on the Western Front during the First World War, and I had German relatives fight on the German side, and I unfortunately, they all on the German side, they all perished, as you would expect. And I lost 4 of my relatives. I lost 2 on the Somme in 1916 at Pozières. I lost the other 2 at Mont Saint Quentin, and they were all cousins. I've got the family connection. Obviously, I didn't know my great uncles, but their stories have been passed down through generations, and it affected us as well, and it's essentially why I got into the study of World War One history and all things military history, because I love it, and I know it's a really bad word to say, but I'm just passionate and I'm interested in hearing the stories and telling the stories of the Anzacs, and also telling the family stories for the people who lost. Mr. and Mrs. Smith lost their only son of Ballarat. It's to tell their stories as well, and that's essentially why I got into history. And I look at the 60 odd thousand that were killed, and like you said, Aaron, every one of those 60,000 plus men, they've all got families, and as you say, the war touched the home front just as much as it did over there as well.
I think Bill Gammage, in his book The Broken Years, he begins by saying that there was never a greater tragedy than the Great War. And I think he's bang on. I mean, the First World War and its legacy leaves an incredible shadow over Australian history. And even though it's not within public memory anymore, I mean, we don't have any First World War veterans still with us. And those who lived during the First World War period are very few and far between. I mean, the effects of the conflict are still being felt today. And certainly we saw that during the First World War centenary, when families were engaging with the past in such vast numbers, researching individuals who've been dead for over 100 years and travelling to the other side of the world to visit their graves and march in their footsteps, so to speak, because it was a good frame of reference. They still keenly felt that sort of intergenerational trauma, but then also the service and sacrifice of an individual who fought in the First World War, of a family member who served in the First World War, is an excellent frame of reference to make sense of the conflict in its totality. But what I also say is that when we're thinking about these massive amounts of casualties, particularly in the latter stages of 1917 and 1918, massive amounts of casualties doesn't necessarily mean a costly or futile or an unsuccessful engagement. Certainly after the fighting at Bullecourt, the Australians go up into Belgium, where they fight their first major actions in around the town of Ypres. There in June and July, the Australians had suffered a further 11,700 casualties in the fighting around the scene. Now, at face value, you would think that was a costly and unsuccessful series of battles, and it was a grisly prelude to the Third Battle of Ypres. And yeah, probably so, but it was of immense tactical success. The whole purpose of the fighting at the scene was a pretext to this battle of the third Battle of Ypres. The British had been really interested in a major offensive action in Belgium to eject the Germans away from the township of Ypres, where the German positions ultimately ringed the city. There was pushed a major salient. People talk about the Ypres salient. And the effort was to really sort of move the Germans away from Ypres and move them away from their submarine bases on the Belgian coast and ultimately eject them from Belgium, because bearing in mind that the German invasion of Belgium is ultimately drew the British Empire in the war in the first place, because from the Belgian coastline, there is a massive German invasion force less than 200 kilometres away from England. So the British, after the fighting on the Somme and then also around Arras in the Bullecourt area, they finally get the go-ahead to conduct their major offensive. And the Brits are really trying to clear the Germans out from Ypres. Messines is just a little bit further south from Ypres, and it was in a relatively quiet area, so much so that the British and Canadian units that had been fighting in that area for the period from 1916-1917 had dug 21 underground mines. They tunneled underneath no man's land and set massive charges of explosives beneath the German positions in expectation for this major offensive to occur. And all that came to a head on the 7th of June 1917, which involved vast numbers of British divisions. It also included the troops of 2nd Anzac Corps, which included the 3rd and 4th Australian divisions, assaulting at once. During this major action is where we see some of the major tactical successes, some of the lessons learned from the Somme and then from Arras, where we have a concentrated bombardment followed by a creeping barrage, behind which are assaulting waves of infantry, also tank assets, and there's aircraft. But most notably, all of those 19 of the 21 mines are detonated simultaneously in what is at that point the largest man-made explosion in the world up until that point. They literally, those mines explode and completely devastate and overwhelm the German frontline positions. The artillery then bombard the German positions with a creeping barrage, so there is a perfect screen of shrapnel and high explosives continually bursting on the German positions, but ultimately moving forward to screen the advancing infantry behind, so that the Germans who have not been killed in those bombardment, the mine explosions, would ultimately be still kept suppressed and away from their machine guns. And then ultimately, when the bombardment moves on, the infantry are already upon them. This is a major success, not just for the Australians, but also for the British. Indeed, that sort of sets the tone for the major offensive that comes from around in Ypres from September through to November 1917. As I mentioned, they result in massive amounts of casualties, but the infantry are ultimately taking their objectives. They're biting into the German positions and they're holding them. And so sometimes you often hear historians talk about bite and hold tactics, and that's ultimately what that is. There's massive amounts of artillery firepower that bite into the German positions, and then the infantry is then advancing and then will ultimately hold them. So this is a sort of a step-by-step approach to the ultimate objective. The main game, of course, begins. It's the Third Battle of Ypres, and this is to break out of the Ypres salient and advance towards and beyond Passchendaele village and the Gelderveld Plateau. And then it was hoped that there would be more fluid, mobile, open warfare and on to eject the Germans from Belgium. So therein the Australians participate in the Third Battle of Ypres. And it's not just one major battle, it's actually a succession of actions involving the Australians, which includes the Battle of Menin Road on the 20th September 1917. There is the Battle of Polygon Wood on the 26th of September 1917, Bridcinder on the 4th of October, Polkapelle on the 9th of October, and then ultimately the assault on Passchendaele village on the 12th of October 1917. And again, massive amounts of firepower, vast quantities of troops who are doing a bite and hold approach. And even though the Australian Imperial force does suffer 38,000 casualties and 6,000 dead alone, that's 6,000 dead from October, and there's 38,000, 8 weeks of fighting, they're ultimately infantry are gaining ground. And I think that's really another important dynamic of fighting on the Western Front, is necessarily just because there's vast quantities of casualties doesn't necessarily mean an action is very costly or futile at all.
No, that's right. Well, we often look at like the Battle of Polygon Wood, and I've walked that battle, as have you, and you can feel that there's a real sense of unrest there, and we almost lost 6,000 men in that battle, and similar to Battle of Fromelles the year before, but we class that as a success, and yet we almost suffer the same amount of casualties, but it's because we achieved the objective. We deem it as a success compared to Fromelles, where we didn't achieve our objective.
Absolutely, and I think you're dead right. I mean, we don't look at the casualty figures as an indicator as to whether or not an action is successful or not. You have a look as to whether or not the attacking formation had achieved their objectives on a tactical level, on an operational level, and then ultimately whether or not the army as a whole had achieved that objective on a strategic level. So the 5th Division is 5th Australian Division is involved in the fighting at Polygon Wood with the 4th Australian Division along to their northern flank. And that's a spectacular, successful assault. It comes off the back of the success of the fighting at Menin Road. Basically, after Menin Road, the infantry dug in, the artillery was brought forward, and all stores and supplies were brought up to the West Hook Ridge in preparation for this next advance forward. It must be said that when we think about the Third Battle of Ypres, we're always thinking about a landscape sort of that is shell-pocked and devoid of any discernible sort of geographic feature. It's a quagmire that meant drowning in mud, endless mud, and certainly that does occur. When the Australians participate in these assaults, though, it's none of that. In fact, the Belgians before the war had used a series of intricate drainage systems within this area to keep that farmland relatively dry and rich and fertile. And then what happens is, well, these vast quantities of artillery power that's designed to suppress the Germans and keep them in their dugouts rather than at their machine guns and screen the assaulting waves of infantry, it completely destroys that landscape and that intricate drainage system. And then ultimately what happens is the autumn rains then set in once the Australians move beyond Polygon Wood, and that's when things start to become stuck in the mud. Artillery pieces aren't able to be brought up forward because they're bogged down in muddy terrain. Infantry assaults are then pressed into completely unsupported, and that's when battles for Passchendaele ultimately earn their grisly reputation. But Polygon Wood is a stunning success, and in fact, the reports, in the after-action reports, particularly for the 55th Battalion, they make mention of smoke and dust that are actually hindering their visibility. So this is actually actions that are taking place in hot, dry, dusty conditions where smoke and dust are impeding the visual identification of reaching their objectives. So ultimately, you have platoon commanders leading their troops into action, probably about 50 metres behind the creeping barrage, and those officers are advancing with their pistols drawn, and they're marching on a compass bearing.
Wow, yeah, right.
I mean, and if you can imagine them covered, their whole front being covered by smoke and dust, I mean, that is the Battle of Polygon Wood. There's very little German resistance because the Germans have completely been overwhelmed. That's not necessarily the case for the 15th Brigade on the far right flank of the assault. I mean, there's a German attack that kind of exploits a situation between them and a neighbouring British division, but before the attack begins. But ultimately, that for the 14th Brigade and the 8th Brigade who succeed in reaching their objectives, I mean, that's the reality, is they're coming across a lot of shattered, demoralised Germans who have had enough of being bombarded, of holding out into their pillboxes and being quite ineffective. That doesn't necessarily mean the casualty toll is quite light. I think the 5th Australian Division suffers around 5,000 casualties. A lot of those are inexperienced troops hugging the barrage too closely, so they're ultimately falling prey to their own artillery fire. And ultimately, the artillery is putting so many rounds through their guns that there are rounds that are inevitably falling short. So I mean, Polygon Wood is a classic example of 5,000 casualties. I mean, that's a vast quantity of human misery. But at the end of the day, it's not a clear indicator of whether it was a success or not, because in the case of Polygon Wood, that whole battle was done and dusted within 90 minutes.
I read up on it, but I didn't know that it had finished so quickly. I thought it was a battle that dragged on for weeks, Aaron. So, and yeah, that astounds me. 90 minutes. Wow.
Well, the infantry were on their objective within 90 minutes, but then, of course, what happens is there is a consolidation phase. Those troops dig in, stores and supplies are brought forward, casualties are evacuated, and then the Germans start to respond. They start to get their backsides into gear. Their artillery fire starts falling on the Australian positions. There is machine guns that are then being redeployed and engaging the new Australian positions. There are German marksmen who are taking pot shots at the Australians. And then that ultimately keeps on occurring until that next lift in the operational phase, which is the Battle of Brudzinda on the 4th of October. And then that next lift, and it's the rinse and repeat operation. The infantry advance behind a rolling curtain of shell fire towards their objectives, and then so on and so forth. But ultimately, the wheels fall off the cart after Brudzinda. Because that terrain, the rains come, turn that terrain into an absolute quagmire. Guns can't be brought forward. They're actually finding it quite difficult to negotiate the mud. German artillery starts to respond in vast quantities, and that's when the impetus of this major offensive really starts to slow right down. So the Australians participate, I think it's the 3rd and 4th Australian Divisions participate in an assault towards Passchendaele village, which is unsuccessful. They try again, and that too is unsuccessful. And just simply, those 38,000 battle casualties the Australians had incurred in those 8 weeks, it gravely affects the ability of the Australians to do their job. And so they're rotated out of the line. The Canadians ultimately rotate in. Canadians that ultimately take Passchendaele village at great cost with the New Zealanders alongside them, and then it's winter again. And what happens during winter? Both sides dig in, then they hold out, and they hunker down for the in the best possible way that they can, and wait for the fighting season to resume in the spring of 1918.
And we know, Aaron, what happened in the spring of 1918, and it's we both know that the Germans launched their spring offensive, and it was that they were successful to a point. But just going back to Polygon Wood for a sec, can you correct me if I'm wrong? But was that the first time since Fromelles that the 5th Australian Division were back in action? Is that correct? Have I read that correct? Or
it's in a major offensive capacity, yes. After Fromelles, what the 5th Australian Division did was it remained in the Fromelles area to rest and recover. It wasn't engaged on the fighting on the Somme until during the Somme winter, till about October 1916. So during that period after Fromelles, the Australian 5th Division remained in that area around outside of Montier, where it did carry out a regular program of patrolling and trench raiding. I think one of the great tragedies of Fromelles is the 5th Australian Division had only been in theatre for about 2 weeks, and it hadn't carried out any major trench raids against the German positions to give its inexperienced troops any experience at all. And so that ultimately is you see that in the combat performance of the 5th Australian Division at Fromelles, where you have guys posting grenades with their pins still inserted. They've never used these things before. So after Fromelles, the Australians remain in that area. They're actually become quite successful at raiding against the German positions, and I write about that in a book called The AIF in Battle, and edited by another Australian historian by the name of Jean Bou. But they make their way onto the Somme in October 1916, just in time for that grisly winter. They participate in some engagements around Fleur and Gourdecourt. They then, after that Somme winter, they participate in a reserve capacity in the assault, and that sort of advanced up to the Hindenburg line. There are some battalions that ultimately rotate into the line around Bullecourt. Rupert Moon, VC, for example, is of the 5th Division. He's awarded his Victoria Cross for inaction at 2nd Bullecourt. But you're right. I mean, the 5th Australian Division doesn't play a sort of primary role in any of these major offensive engagements, really, until Polygon Wood. And I mean, they'd suffered, over 5,000 casualties in one night at Fromelles. and they've just suffered another 5,000 in a very successful action at Polygon Wood. And in fact, what's interesting is that at Polygon Wood is where they erected their divisional monument after the war. On the Western Front, the 5 Australian infantry divisions have memorials to their victories. It was the men selected it themselves, and they certainly were very proud of their stunning successes against the Imperial German Army. The 1st Australian Division, theirs was at Pozières, the 2nd at Mont-Saint-Quentin in 1918. The 3rd Australian Division was the defence of the Somme, the northern banks of the Somme River in early 1918. The 4th Australian Division was punching through the Hindenburg line at Bellenglise in 1918, and the 5th Australian Division at Polygon Wood. So they're all significant victories involving the Australians, and I think that's quite an interesting little sort of dynamic to the way in which the war on the Western Front is commemorated.
Oh, absolutely, mate. And like you said, particularly the 4th Australian Division, it's probably the least visited by any pilgrim who goes to the Western Front because it's so far east to the Somme and the French Flanders, and it's probably one of the least visited memorials on the Western Front.
And certainly one of the least accessible because you have to negotiate a hairpin turn on a small dirt road in a coach, inevitably, usually filled with 30 people. And that's actually quite no mean feat. But once you get there, it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere. But of course, in 1918, it was somewhere because this was ground and the Germans had erected their Hindenburg line fortifications, extension of the same defensive system that the Australians tried to penetrate in 1917. But that's ultimately where the 4th Australian Division did penetrate the Hindenburg line in September 1918 with vast quantities of British troops, with tanks, with artillery, with aircraft, and supplemented by some their units were supplemented by some Americans to make good the shortfall in troop numbers. So by that stage, of course, the tactics had evolved again. There had been absolute success from Hamel all the way through to the Battle of Amiens, involving those close coordination of infantry, tanks, artillery, and infantry all working together in concert. And that's why the 4th Division is at Bellenglise. Ultimately, it was its last major action on the Western Front. So a stunning success and something that meant a lot to the men who fought in those engagements.
This is a great thing about this podcast. The thing is, you can jump from topic to topic, and that's the best thing about it, Aaron, is that you can talk about 1916, then into 1917, then also into 1918. It's really good that you can sort of look at the whole 3 years on the Western Front. And just jump across again, in your opinion, do you feel that the Battle of Passchendaele, do you actually feel that it should have gone ahead after the rains had set in and the battle was a quagmire? Do you feel that that's a mistake of General Haig of still ordering the battle to go ahead?
It's a really good question, and as a historian, we always look back into these events, and it's crystal clear 2020 hindsight. And the fact that Haig cops a lot of criticism up the wall for continually pursuing these attacks when the terrain and when the weather conditions were not ideal, and ultimately result in the decimation of formations. But then also too, Haig, this is the one chance that the army, that he could pursue the offensive that he's wanted to pursue ever since becoming the commander-in-chief. And they know that once winter comes, both sides will settle down for the winter and hug the ground until spring. So they're trying to gain as much terrain as what they possibly can. Haig is certainly he's inculcated with the ever elusive offensive spirit. He's really trying to continue these attacks as best they can, and mainly, if you have a look at the performance of those assaulting units that were involved in those actions, from Menin Road all the way through to the assaulting on Passchendaele, yes, they result in large amounts of casualties, but they're very successful in capturing ground. So Haig is trying to capture as much ground as possible before winter comes, and to try and move the Germans as far away from Ypres as possible. And ultimately, he's defeated by the weather. He's defeated by casualties, and he's defeated by public opinion. both in the British Parliament and then also back home and also by historians from the 1960s onwards, who generally tend to point to this period in Haig's career and vilify him for it. And this is where his sort of honorific as being a butcher and bungler really comes to the fore. But of course, it comes out of sheer desperation to try and capture as much ground as possible, albeit costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of men.
But as we know, Aaron, that war is a costly business, and I feel that the criticism to Haig is unfounded because, you know, everyone speaks of General Monash and how amazing he was, and I don't take anything away from General Monash and what he did, but you've got to see Haig as people like yourself and others. You've got to see that Haig was in charge of 5 armies. Like, that's a whole nother world from being a corps commander of 5 Australian divisions. And I don't say that lightly to Monash. I don't want to run him down, as people have often stated that Australians won the war, which that's just ludicrous, because we were part of the British overall, the British victory, and we helped achieve the overall British and French victory, and that's how you've got to look at it from an Australian point of view.
Yeah. Absolutely, and I mean, anybody who wants to explore that and learn a little bit more about that, there is a fantastic book by the eminent British historian Gary Sheffield in his very accessible and very readable book called Forgotten Victory. And what it does, it looks at the conduct of British operations on the Western Front from 1916 through to 1918. In clarity. It demystifies a lot of the many myths and stereotypes that exist abounding about the British generals and the poor bloody infantry, perhaps coloured by the likes of Blackadder or yes. Oh What a Lovely War and all that sort of stuff, and does a really good job at offering some sort of sense of method to the madness, and it does offer somewhat of a corrective for Haig. It gives us a better understanding of Haig as an individual, as a soldier, and certainly much more than the butcher and bungler that he's often purported to be. I will say this about Monash. I think Monash was a brilliant commander. He led the Australian Imperial force during its most significant victories on the Western Front, including those operations, including Hamel, the August Offensive, and then also the Australian participation in the 100 Days Offensive. Under Monash, Australians achieved immense great things. But in 8 weeks of fighting, the Australia Corps suffers over 36,000 casualties during those successes. That's just as many casualties as the Australians incurred during the Third Battle of Ypres under British command.
The numbers speak for themselves. Like I said, Aaron, I'm not trying to defame or put down Monash. I just think that for our listeners, we have to put into perspective that Monash, yes, he was a great commander, and we honour what he did, and certainly take nothing away from him. But also too, he did push his men almost to breaking point.
Yeah, well, he did. He pushed his men to breaking point, to the point where by September and October 1918, some units are refusing to go into line. Well, perhaps that might be the subject of another podcast, about Monash, fact or fiction.
I think we could get you on and definitely have a chat about that. I think that would be it'd be an interesting topic, and I think it'd be one that would be debated by many people, I think, because I think a lot of people feel that Monash won the war, and it's certainly not it's certainly people like yourself and others who love World War One and have looked into it. It's definitely, yes, we didn't win the war. We'd like to. We beat the drum. We beat the drum that we did win the war, but unfortunately we didn't. We were part of the French and British overall victory. We helped. We were a small part in the overall victory. Same as the Canadians, same as the South Africans, the New Zealanders. We all played a part in the overall victory, and that's how I think we've got to see it. And definitely, mate. But mate, we've spoken for over an hour, and it's been terrific, mate. Like, it's absolutely been. I've just enjoyed the whole chat, and just basically to sum up, how can people support you, Aaron? Like, where can they buy your books from?
Yeah, well, look, Adam, it's been an absolute privilege to be on your show and talk about the AIF in 1917. If there's any sort of concluding sentence, I guess I wanted to say is that the Australian Imperial Force is severely hampered by its immense amount of casualties that it incurs during 1917. As I said, of the 180,000 battle casualties the Australians suffer on the Western Front for the duration of the conflict, there is nearly 90,000 of them are lost during the battles of 1917. That has a massive impact on Australia's all-volunteer army. Reinforcement quotas coming from Australia are not keeping units at full strength. The AIF or the Australian public have rejected the idea of conscription. And so 1918 begins the final year of the Great War, where success, victory and defeat hang in the balance for both the Germans and the British. But then also too, the AIF begins that fight devoid of about 11,000 men. So the story of the AIF ultimately is one of victory and defeat, but then also too, it's struggling to maintain momentum. It's participating in some of the most successful actions of the war, but battalions are being reduced ordinarily from 1,000 men down to 200. By 1918, the AIF is completely exhausted. But look, thank you very much. My books are all available for sale at any good bookshop, of course, only the good ones. You can, of course, my latest book, Surviving the Great War, Australian Prisoners of War on the Western Front, 1916 to 1918, is available for sale for about $59 through Amazon.com.au, through Book Depository, but of course through the War Memorial gift shop. If you buy them through the War Memorial gift shop, you may be able to pick up either a signed copy, or if you order online through the War Memorial's e-shop and make a request, I'm more than happy to make out a personal inscription to any of your listeners. Also, too, for Valour, Australians awarded the Victoria Cross, which is the story, the book that I wrote with my colleague, curator at the War Memorial, Craig Blanche. That is also for sale through the War Memorial gift shop as well. So, that would be the best way to support us is through active and interest engagement with some of our works. I'm also on Twitter at Pegram Aaron. I mainly sort of engage in conversation there with people who are interested in what I'm doing and the projects that I'm involved in. So, give us a follow and say good day, and let us know that you heard this chat on your podcast.
No, thanks.
My absolute pleasure, Adam, and best of luck for the episodes of the future.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. G'day! Have you ever wondered about the stories of sacrifice behind your ancestor or relative, medals or photos? Perhaps you'd like to visit their grave or memorial. Or would you like to discover why your relative traded the comfort of home and family for hardship, and in many cases, death, in a foreign land? Researching your family's military history will take you on a journey that will inspire and shock you at what was endured. If you're not sure where to start or find navigating websites and exercise in frustration, I'd like to introduce you to the Answered the Call, How to Research World War I Australian Imperial Force Soldiers 1914 to 1918. In this easy-to-use online course, you'll learn how to confidently uncover your family's fascinating story. With its simple and practical approach, there's never been a better time than right now to start your research. If you're passionate about learning more about your family's World War I service, then I'd like to invite you to watch the course webinar on the attached link.